All righty, welcome, folks. Can everybody hear me there? I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen just to make sure that everything is up and running here and all good. So if you're able to see my screen, it should say planning the perfect garden. Go ahead, let me know in the chat function that you're able to see that, and we'll be all good and start getting on our way here. Okay, I can see Andrew saying all good. Right on. Mike can hear me. Hey, Growing Pains. Hey, Ashley from Burnaby. Great to have you. Hey, Michelle from Penticton. Val over in Campbell River. Welcome, 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 everybody. Super excited to be kicking off for the gardening season ahead here. And it's starting to feel a little bit like spring. So, really looking forward to taking each and every one of you through today's live happy hour on how to go about planning the perfect garden. For any of you that I have not yet met, I am Jordan, and I founded Mind and Soil a couple years ago now in 2020 with the intention of introducing a million individuals to gardening's mental health benefits. And so, what I'm hoping for from this evening is certainly to help you in bringing your garden to life this season and for it to be yielding a great bounty and harvest. But even more so than that is to be helping you connect with how peaceful, how calming, and how restorative the garden can be. And for it to really become a place that you turn to each and every week to find a little bit of that peacefulness and a little bit of that joy. And so, with that being said, I want to go ahead and start diving into things here for the evening. And I've got just a couple of housekeeping items for us to touch on. So, the first piece is that, of course, we are going to be talking through how to go about planning the garden. And I'm going to break that down into 5 steps that we're going to go through. Now, as we go through things, any questions that you have, go ahead and put those into the chat function. So just to make sure that everybody knows where the chat function is and that it's working, let me know in the chat function, how many years have you been gardening for? Is this your first year, second, third? You've been gardening for a couple of years. Do we have anybody in the 20 years, 30 years, 40 years mark? Every now and then there's somebody that's been gardening for quite a few years. Let me know in the chat function how long you've been gardening for. And if you aren't able to access the chat function, it's probably just because you aren't yet subscribed to the channel. So you should see a little white or red button that says subscribe. Once you have subscribed to the channel, then you're going to be able to partake in the chat as well. And then the last piece is grab yourself a snack, something to drink, kick back and relax. I don't want this looking or feeling anything like a work meeting. That's why I've got the happy hour shirt on. So again, allow yourself to kind of have the next hour to just kick back and relax and take in some gardening content and knowledge. So let's see in the chat function here. Okay, I can see Lorna is saying 30 years. Jerry's got 9. Bella is 2, 12 for Linda, Mandy with 8, Doug and Jackie 45. Amazing. Love it. FIBA with 1 year. Awesome. Well, welcome everybody. Awesome to have you. Now, for happy hours this year, I'm going to have different sponsors throughout the year. So, some of my different friends throughout the gardening world, the gardening space, they're going to sponsor some of these happy hours. But for this very first happy hour, I decided to hold on to the sponsorship for myself and kind of share a little bit with you about my online gardening mentorship, Grounded. So I'm not going to chat too much about it right now. We're going to talk more about it towards the end. But this is something that I've launched this season. And the whole kind of purpose or intent behind it is that I know gardening can be a little bit daunting, a little bit overwhelming to get started with and to feel comfortable with. And so, on top of education like this, I know there's a lot of questions that could come up throughout the season. And as a mentee in Grounded, we have calls every single week where it's just like in office hours where I'm there to guide you, support you, answer your questions all throughout the season to kind of keep you on the right track as we progress through the gardening calendar. And all throughout, you're interacting with myself and other like-minded individuals that also want to be, growing a beautiful garden, but connecting with also how peaceful, calming, and restorative it is. So we're going to share more about that as we go through today's session. But with that being said, if you're all set, all ready for me to begin diving into the 5 steps to be planning out your perfect garden, go ahead, share in the chat function. Let's grow. Let me know in the chat function, and I'm going to start diving in here. And I'm not sure if anybody is in the same position as me at the moment, but your backyard might be looking a little bit like this. It's kind of frozen. It's definitely frosty. There isn't anything growing yet. And that makes right now the perfect time to be taking a little bit of a step back to begin planning out the garden. And so these 5 steps that I'm about to walk you through are what transform this space from being completely quiet and nothing happening in it to, in the middle of summer, absolutely teeming with life. We got tomatoes all over the place, peppers right in here. The garlic was just harvested out of this bed, and we got beets and carrots growing in there. The sunflowers at the very back there, they can't even fit into the picture. They're 12, 13 feet tall. So by utilizing these 5 steps, each and every one of your gardens is going to be looking like this, and you're going to be getting beautiful harvests just like this of cucumbers, squashes, kale, grapes, fruits, flowers, different herbs, everything in between. So the question really becomes, where do we get started? What's the first thing that we need to do? And the very first step of planning out the garden is to dream about the season ahead. I know that right now it's a really exciting time. There's so much kind of like pent up energy coming out of the winter with a desire to start all kinds of seeds. But what I encourage you to actually do is slow down for a second and to just dream a little bit about the season ahead. And there's really 3 questions that I encourage you to ask yourself when it comes to developing your garden plan for the upcoming season. And what I'm going to say just before I share those 3 questions is that all 3 of them and everything that we're going to go through this evening is in my garden planning guide, which I've got right here. And I'm going to be emailing out to each and every one of you that has RSVP'd tomorrow morning. So you're going to have this in your inbox tomorrow. So don't feel like you need to write everything out this evening. You're going to get this guide tomorrow morning. So what are those 3 questions? Well, the very first one that I encourage you to ask yourself is simply, what one word describes how you want to feel while you're in the garden this season? So take yourself to July and it's a warm summer evening. What's the word that describes the way that you feel when you're puttering throughout your garden there? What is that feeling? Go ahead and share that with me in the chat function. Let's hear what some of the words are that people would use to describe how they want to feel when they're in the garden. For myself, the word that comes to mind for me each and every season is restoration. So honestly, like above and beyond even the fruits, the vegetables, the flowers, is that I want the garden to be a place that I can go to slow down, to decompress, to recharge my batteries. You know, like literally just 15 minutes ago, I was out there just taking a couple minutes of slow and calm time, raking up a couple of leaves that were on my garden path. And that's what the garden is all about for me. And the fruits, the vegetables, the flowers, that's just kind of like a fun way or a fun avenue to be accessing that form of restoration. So first piece that I encourage you to think through is just, how do I want to be feeling while I'm out there in the garden? Because we don't want it to become something that's stressful or overwhelming or anything along those lines. Now, the second question is one that I'm sure folks have already spent a little bit of time thinking about, which is simply, what vegetables, fruits, herbs do you love to eat? And I'd love to hear in the chat function what some of these are for folks. What are those vegetables or those fruits or those herbs that you love to be eating, that you'd be enjoying, and just be like so excited about harvesting straight from your garden this upcoming season? Let me know in the chat function here. And for myself, a couple of these include kale, basil, tomatoes, of course. I'm sure I'm not the only one on that front, zucchinis, and onions as well. And the reason why I encourage you to spend a couple of minutes thinking through this is because the moment that we walk into that nursery or we log on to West Coast Seeds and we start looking through the different seed packets that are out there, our eyes get, so big, much bigger than perhaps what our gardening space is, or the amount of time and energy that we have available for our garden. And then next thing you know, it's like in the middle of summer and we're growing parsnips. And it's like, I've never once bought parsnips from the grocery store, nor do I even know what to do with it. And it's taken up a little bit of precious real estate in the garden. So this is where, once again, I encourage you to slow down, think through what some of those vegetables are that you love to be eating, that you want to be harvesting this upcoming season. And we'll start from there. And then if there is any leftover space, that's where we can then get a little bit more exploratory with different fruits, different vegetables, different herbs to be fitting into our gardens. And then the third and final piece that I encourage you to think through, and this might be a new one for each and everybody here, is what are a few experiments that you are excited to run this season? And so one that I am running right now that's going to lead into this season is overwintered onions versus onion sets versus onion seedlings. So to give you some context on this, back in the fall, I planted some onions in 2 rows in my garden. And I'm hoping that they are going to be able to overwinter, survive the cold temperatures, and begin growing over the course of the next 1 to 2 months here. Now, when that happens in the early spring, I'm then going to plant another 2 rows of onion sets that I bought from West Coast Seeds. I'm going to get those into the next 2 rows in that same raised bed. And then directly beside them, I'm going to transplant in some onion seedlings that I'm starting in the wintertime right around now. So I'm going to have side by side overwintered onions, onion sets, and onion seedlings. Fast forward to middle of the summertime, I'm going to harvest all of those at the same time, and I'm going to be able to see which one of these methods ultimately resulted in and yielded the best results. The reason why experimentation is such a great way to approach gardening is because it creates this incredible positive feedback loop. Because when that time comes when I harvest, regardless of how big or how small the harvest is, I'm going to have an insight on which one of these methods worked best. And I can then take that insight into the next season and apply it. And that's going to get ultimately a larger bounty harvest yield of onions. And when I get that insight, it is always filled with a ton of excitement for the next gardening season. Because it's like, dang, I now know that onion seedlings perform the best. I can't wait to do all 6 of these rows as onion seedlings for next year. And that draws us further into the garden. And at that time, I would do another experiment and get another learning and be excited once again for the upcoming gardening season to run that next experiment and to be growing as a gardener. So running experiments and utilizing experiments, it ultimately allows you to really improve as a gardener. And at the same time, it creates this positive feedback loop that takes off some of the pressure and allows you to enjoy your time in the garden a little bit more. So that's all. Those are the 3 questions that I kind of encourage you to think through as we lead into the gardening season. And what's really cool about this is we now know kind of like these are the vegetables that I want to have in my garden. And that brings us into step number 2, which is to draw out your garden space. So we now want to draw out our garden space because in a minute, we're going to place those vegetables into our dream garden here. And so the way that we go about doing this is we take a look at our growing space. And as we can see in my backyard here, I've got a little herb box over here, and then I've got a raised bed here, a second raised bed 3, and raised bed 4. And then on the back wall there, I've got a little bit of like a contoured kind of shaped garden back there. And so what I want to now be doing is thinking through how do I go about getting that kale that I'm excited to grow, that basil, those tomatoes, where do I place those into the garden? So what I need to do is I need to draw out this garden space here. And the way that I go about doing that is I once again am going to be utilizing the garden planning guide that I'm sending over to you tomorrow morning because it has graph paper directly in it. So you've got graph paper right here. And I encourage you to utilize graph paper because you can then assume that each one of these square feet each one of the lines represents 1 foot. So we've got the first line there, and that's 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, and 4 feet. And then going up this way, we've got 1 foot, 2 foot, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. That means that this is a 4 foot by 8 foot raised bed. And sure enough, for myself, the second raised bed is the exact same, 4 feet by 8 feet. Same thing for raised bed 3 and raised bed 4. So just like that, I've kind of drawn out the square footage of where I'm going to be growing. If I wanted, I could also add in that herb box over here, as well as that contoured garden on the back side there. But for this evening's purposes, we're just going to keep it nice and simple with those 4 raised beds. Now, once you've drawn out your growing space, the next thing that I really encourage you to add on are sun icons. And so as we can see on this back bed here, I've put a full sun icon right there. And what I encourage you to think through on this front is not that like this is full sun versus partial sun, but rather this is your sunniest areas versus your less sunny areas, because it's going to vary for each and every one of us. And what we want to be doing is finding our sunniest pockets and getting those crops that require the most sun into those parts of our garden. So I know that bed there, it gets full sun. Now, what I also know is the bed right beside it, it gets full sun at the back and partial sun at the front. Now, why is that? And check this out. I literally took this picture yesterday and it like shows this perfectly. So as we can see, here's that first raised bed and it already is in full sun. And then the next bed right beside it, raised bed number 2, what we can see is this front section, it's not yet getting the sun. And the back part, it is getting the sun. The reason why is because we can see the sun there. It's just now starting to peek over the chief. But even over the course of the next month or so, the house here is still going to make a little bit of a shade sail and keep this shaded from the sun. As we get into the peak of summer, it's going to get more sun. But what I know is that kind of at the beginning of the season and the end of the season, these are less sunny areas than, say, this back bed right here. So this back bed, that's where I want to be saving my absolute kind of sunniest crops for. And I'd want to be putting some of my sunnier crops in the back of these beds here. So as you go about drawing out your garden plan, don't put just one sun icon. The more sun icons that you place, the better, because that's going to allow you to really understand, okay, this is a little shady area, this is a sunnier area, and that's going to allow you to get the crops into the best area. And what I would also just quickly touch on this front is that this isn't something that we figure out over the course of one season. Use kind of like your best judgment, your best guess for this season, and then observe in June, in July, where you correct which areas are maybe getting a little bit more sun than you thought right now in February. And that's, again, all insight that you're going to take and apply into the following season. For myself, it's taken me like 3 to 4 years to really understand the different little growing zones and growing pockets in just my one backyard. So do know that it's not a matter of getting it perfectly right in this first season, but rather getting a first round at it. And then we can continue to make iterations each and every season from there. So now we've got our garden all drawn out. The third thing that we need to do and our third step is to add our vegetables into the garden. And what I'm going to say here just before we dive into step number 3 is that we're going to pause after step 3 and do kind of 1 to 2 questions and answer those. So if you have any questions, kind of start thinking through those, and we'll touch on a couple of them in just a minute. And on top of that, this is the one step that might seem a little bit complex at the beginning, but just hang with me for the next 5 to 10 minutes. And if you make it through the first kind of example or second example, believe me, it's going to be really, really straightforward, and you're going to be in a really, really great position for the season ahead here. So really focus in for the next 5 to 10 minutes, and then we're going to take a quick pause for a couple of questions before going through step 4 and 5, which are super quick ones. All righty. So how do we go about adding those vegetables into our garden here? And so remember, in step 1, we wrote down the vegetables that we're most excited to be growing and harvesting and enjoying in the middle of summer. We want to have kale salads. We want to have basil on a fresh sandwich or in a pasta, tomatoes as well, zucchini. I discovered a really cool summer squash salad with them sliced really, really thinly last year. Now, how do we get those into that drawn out garden space? So also in the garden planning guide is a space planner. And all that we need to do is find the vegetable that we're interested in, such as kale, and then take this information and then apply it into the drawing. So with kale, what I can see is how much sun does kale require? It doesn't require tons of sun. It's kind of a partial sun plant. Therefore, I don't want to dedicate my sunniest areas to kale. Now, how much space does kale require? Kale requires 1 square foot for each kale plant. And that's the thing that we see in the next piece here, is that how many kale plants can we fit into that square foot? 1 plant. So I know that I need 1 square foot per kale plant. All that I now do is I go back to my drawing and I add in kale plant 1, kale plant 2, kale plant 3, kale plant 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And as you can see, I put those at the very front of this bed where it is partial sun. So they're not in the back of the bed or in bed number 1 over here where it's full sun. They're in an area that doesn't get quite as much sun. All right, so the first one, it's already in. Let's move on to our second vegetable, and that is basil. Let's kind of go through the information here. How much sun does basil like and require? Basil loves a full sun environment. The more sun, the more heat for basil, the absolute better it's going to grow. As a matter of fact, what I do with my basils, I actually get a clear storage tote from Home Depot or Walmart. I drill some holes into the top and I put that directly over top of my basil to make it a little bit of like a mini greenhouse for it at the beginning and the end of the season. That gives it a huge head start on the season. So it wants lots of sun, lots of heat. Now, how many square feet are required for basil? And once again, it's only 1 square foot. Now, how many basil plants can we fit into that square foot? And it goes to 4 basil plants in this time. And the reason why it's 4 basil plants is because basil is a much smaller plant than kale. So we've got, a kale plant that's going to grow quite large, but because basil stays much smaller, kind of a little bit more bushy, we can fit a couple more in there. We can plant it a little bit more densely. We take something like carrots or radishes, and we can plant those even more densely, maybe 9 or 16 per square foot. So that's the reason why we've got multiple basil plants per square foot. So we now have this information. We go back over to our drawing, and we now add in basil. So I've got my first square foot here for basil, second square foot, third square foot, fourth square foot for basil. But keep in mind, each one of these square feet for basil represents 4 basil plants. So really this is 4 basil plants, 8, 12, 16 basil plants in just those 4 square feet. We are going to have all kinds of pesto this upcoming summer. So we've got basil now into the garden. I have a feeling that you're probably starting to get the hang of how this runs and operates. Let's move on to our third vegetable, and that is tomatoes. And once again, let's start pulling the information here. So how much sun do tomatoes require? They also love as much sun as possible. We want to be giving them some of that precious sunny real estate. Now, how many squares are required for tomatoes? This time it goes up to 2. So as we can see, tomatoes are the first plant that fall into the large plants that we've chatted about here. We want to give them a little bit more space because they're going to grow really, really large. And how many tomato plants can we fit into that larger square? We can only fit 1 tomato in there. Perfect. We've got all the information. We go back over to our drawing and we now add in our tomatoes. And as you can see, I did a little kind of like partition using some dotted lines to put my first tomato plant in. So we got tomato plant 1 and it's got 2 feet. Then we got tomato plant 2 here and it's also got 2 square feet. Tomato plant 3, tomato plant 4, tomato plant 5, and tomato plant 6. And what you probably notice here is that I didn't just do tomatoes in one line, I actually staggered them. And the reason why I staggered them is for kind of 2 reasons. First one is that it allows more airflow between the plants, and that's going to decrease the likelihood of diseases setting in and being passed from one plant to the next. Second piece is that it creates more space for the tomatoes' leaves and the canopy of leaves to spread out and absorb as much sun or energy from the sun. The more energy from the sun that they're able to absorb, the more that they're able to direct that towards fruit development, the more tomatoes that you're then able to harvest off of your plant. So consider kind of having yours on a little bit of a stagger there just to introduce a little bit more space for them. So now we've got our tomatoes in there. We're on to our last vegetable that we're going to be putting into the garden for tonight's session. So if you do have any questions on this first 3 steps here, let me know in the chat function because we're going to pause after zucchinis to answer 1 or 2 questions. So start kind of firing through any questions that you have into the chat function there. So now let's get those zucchinis into the bed. And these are the big boys. So let's go through the information. They also love as much sun as possible. But now the big thing is how many square feet are required for our zucchinis? And they require 4 square feet. All right, so we got 4 square feet that we need for our zucchinis. Now, how many zucchinis are going to fit into each one of those square feet? only one zucchini plant. So now that we have that information, we go back to our drawing. And as you can see, I've now partitioned 4 square feet for my zucchinis. And we've got zucchini plant 1 and we've got zucchini plant 2. So we've got those in the back there. And just like that, each and every one of the vegetables that I'm excited to be growing this upcoming season are into my garden, not just in the garden, but also in the best space from a sun perspective and with the right amount of space around them for them to grow to their fullest potential. So that's the exact process that you would utilize for the first 3 steps of planning out your garden here. Now, what I want you to do is take a nice big breath. That's a good amount of information. I know it can be maybe a little bit overwhelming at once. And so this is where I want us to slow down for a minute or two here and just kind of catch our breath before we move into step 4 and 5, because again, I know that's a good amount of information and I'd like to answer 1 or 2 questions in the chat function here. So I'm going to take a look here. Let's see if we can find 1 or 2. Okay, question from Rowena. What would you recommend adding to a garden bed at the beginning of the year to add nutrients? That is a super good question. At the beginning of the gardening season, I always add 1 inch of compost across the bed. The way that you'd like to think about this as kind of like a soil bank account. As the plants grow, they are withdrawing nutrients from the beds. Therefore, we need to be making investments back into that soil bank account. And so adding 1 inch of compost, that is an investment of nutrients as well as microbial life into the garden. Now let's, and then at the point of transplanting, when I then transplant in, say, that zucchini plant or that basil plant or those tomato plants, I'm going to dig the transplant hole. I'm then going to take 1 handful of my worm castings and put that into there, into the transplant hole. And then I'm going to grab 1 tablespoon of my 444 organic fertilizer. And we'll put that in the transplant hole. And then I'm going to put in my seedling, whether that's a tomato plant, a zucchini plant, a basil plant, backfill it. And then I like to do 1 more tablespoon of my 444 organic fertilizer, just sprinkled around the base of that plant. And I scratch that into the top inch of the soil. That is all that I do. I keep it really, really simple. The things that I rely on are compost, worm castings, and organic fertilizer. Great question there. Let's see if we've got a couple more questions or maybe 1 more question that we could answer here. And I'd love to hear as well in the chat function, how's this been so far? Is anybody learning anything new? Anybody getting any new insights? Is this helping to answer some of the garden planning questions that you may have? Let me know on that front as well there. Okay, amazing question from Lee here. You're looking at the sun and shade of each bed. How much do you think about the height of the plants? Really good question there, Lee. So let's actually go back to my drawing here. And so what we can see is that I've got my tomatoes right now planted right in the middle of the bed. And then I've got my zucchinis at the very back. And now what I know is that the sun is coming from this side here across the bed. And the tomatoes, I also know those are going to grow 4, 5, 6 feet tall. And so that could actually create a shade sail that would block the zucchinis. So as I'm building out my garden plan here, what I would actually do is I'd probably look at that and be like, I should probably move my tomatoes to the very back of the bed. And so I'd move my tomatoes just to the very back here, and then I'd slide the zucchinis forward a little bit. And so it's very common while I'm doing my garden planning like this to like pencil something in, but then as I fill the rest of things in, remove it or bring it over to another area, and just kind of playing a little bit of Tetris at the very beginning, which is why I just came up with the greatest hack ever for this upcoming season. Check this out, Lee and everybody. What I did this year, after I printed out my garden planning guide that I'm going to send to each of you tomorrow morning, I took it to my local print shop and I laminated it, because now I can draw in my tomatoes or my zucchinis, but then I can erase them really quickly, move them over to another area, and I don't have to be starting from scratch. I'm not like ripping through the paper, anything along those lines. So what I encourage you to do tomorrow is when you print this out, and the second page is literally all graph paper. So you've got a full page of graph paper. Take that to your local print shop, have them laminate it, You'll thank me later. Believe me, everybody that's done it so far is like, that was just so satisfying. Such a good idea there. So really, really good question, Lee. I would put the taller growing plants towards the back and the shorter plants in front of them based on the sun being on this side, short plants here, and then taller plants at the back. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to, continue along, and we're going to do more Q&A towards the end here. But just those two questions right there are such great examples of questions that are, somewhat related to garden planning, but also just towards gardening in general. And I know that there's like so many questions that come up all throughout the season. And again, this is why I launched Grounded, because we do lessons like this, where each month I'm teaching on a particular topic. So with all of my mentees, next Thursday, I'm teaching them all about indoor seed starting and how to start your seeds indoors. But the thing is, that's way different, is that every Thursday of the month, there is a live office hours where we all hop on, we kick it off with a guided meditation just to slow down from our respective days. And the whole hour is dedicated to me just answering questions and supporting each of the mentees throughout the gardening season. And this runs from now all the way until October. So if you've got questions around how to be starting your seeds, how to be transplanting things into the garden, how to be setting up irrigation and trellises and all of that, now it's no longer going through all the different videos and blogs online and getting contradicting pieces of information. You literally have me in your back pocket, and I'm pulling you off of mute, and we're chatting through it together during those live office hours. And you're doing it with a group of other gardeners that also want to be bringing these beautiful gardens to life, but be doing so in a way that brings them that peacefulness and that joy and that restoration as well. So at the end of our session, I'm going to be sharing with you how you can book an enrollment call with me to join into Grounded, because I've just now opened up the February enrollments for Grounded. So hang tight on that one. We're going to chat a little bit more about it towards the very end there. But what I want to do next is dive into step 4 and step 5, and then we'll wrap up by chatting about Grounded and doing more Q&A. So just to kind of recap where we're at, we've done a little bit of reflection on the season ahead. We've drawn out our gardening space, and now we've placed the vegetables that we're most excited to grow into the garden. So we kind of have a pretty good feel for what we want our garden to look like. That means that step 4 is to determine how many seeds we want to be starting. And so what we're going to be doing on this front is we first need to figure out, how many plants do we have in the garden? And once again, in the garden planning guide, I have this laid out in a chart for you. So all that we need to do is go through each crop that we've now placed into our garden and add up the number of plants that we anticipate having in the garden. So I start with kale. Now I'm going to go to my drawing and I'm going to find out how many drawn out squares do I have for kale. So as I can see, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 squares are drawn out. Now remember, some plants though, they've got multiple plants in that one square. So how many kale plants are in each one of these squares? And what we can see here is that for kale, there's 1 plant per square. So I add that information in. Now, 8 multiplied by 1 means that right now I have 8 kale plants planned for my garden. I move on to the next crop. That is basil. How many squares are drawn? 1, 2, 3, 4. I add that into my chart. But now how many basil plants are in each one of those squares? 4 basil plants are in each one of those squares. 4 multiplied by 4 means I'm going to have 16 basil plants in my garden. We continue along to tomatoes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Perfect. How many tomatoes are in each of those larger squares? Only 1. 6 multiplied by 1 is 6. And we continue with zucchinis. We've got 2 plants in there. We know that we're only fitting 1 zucchini plant into each of those 4 square foot areas. And that means that we have 2 zucchini plants in the garden. So right now I can see I've got 8 kale plants, 16 basil plants, 6 tomato plants, and 2 zucchini plants, planned for my 2024 garden. And this is once again where I encourage you to do, just a little check-in, be like, how does that land with me? And maybe you're like, 8 kale plants, that feels like a little bit too many. I'm going to decrease that to 4. You go back to your drawing, you erase those. Maybe, that's now opened up 4 square feet. Maybe you do 2 more tomato plants. So now it'd be 4 and then, 8 tomato plants there. So again, like just do a couple passes on this, see how it fits with you, how it's kind of landing. And again, this is the beautiful part about gardening, is that like it is evolving each and every year. So don't feel a weight or a pressure of like getting it perfectly right, but rather have a hypothesis that like, I think this is the right garden for this season. And then as you go through the season, you're going to realize, ooh, I would have loved to have more basil or more cucumbers, what have you. And you take that insight into the following year. For tonight, let's just assume that we're going to keep it as is. Now the question becomes, how many seeds do I need to start in order to get those 8 kale plants, 16 basil plants, 6 tomato plants, and 2 zucchinis? Let's use the zucchinis as an example. Should I start just 2 zucchini seeds? And the answer is no, because there's some seeds that simply won't germinate. So we always want to start more seeds than plants that we desire to have in the garden, because that gives us a higher likelihood of ultimately ending up with the number of plants. So my recommendation is to start 3 to 5 seeds per desired plant. And that might seem or feel like quite a few, right? If you're starting 10 zucchini seeds to only get 2 zucchini plants, and it's very likely that you're probably going to end up with 5, 6, or 7 of those seeds germinating and beginning to grow. So what do you do then? Well, you've got 2 options. First, you've got your pick of the litter. You get to now choose the 2 biggest, healthiest zucchini seedlings in all of the ones that germinated. So you're getting the best seedlings into your garden. It does not hurt to have extra seedlings. And then the second piece is give them away to friends, family, neighbors, anything along those lines. Pass along that gift of gardening. I can guarantee you right now, you share with your friends, your family, your neighbors on a local like Facebook group that you've got free seedlings, you will make somebody's day. I guarantee it. And you're passing along that gift of gardening. So it's really a win-win to end up having too many seedlings that you have started. So let's kind of start by going off of 5. All that we now do is we multiply the desired number of plants by 5 seeds. So I want 8 kale plants. That means I'm going to start 5 seeds per plant. 8 multiplied by 5 equals 40 kale seeds, 80 basil seeds, 30 tomato seeds, and 10 zucchini seeds. As you progress along with your seed starting, you might notice in a year or 2 years, like I had way too many tomato plants. So I'm going to decrease that to only starting 3 seeds per tomato plant for the following season. So then you just do 6 multiplied by 3 means you'd be starting 18 tomato seeds. And it still might seem like a lot of seeds that you're starting, but just like put this into like reference or perspective, one small pack of basil seeds usually has 300 to 500 seeds in it. So it's kind of might look like a lot right now, but believe me, as you start getting into it, it ends up not really being that much at all. Alrighty, so we now know exactly how many seeds we want to be starting to get all those plants into our garden for this upcoming season. The 5th and final piece is simply to determine when do we go about starting these seeds, and at kind of like at what month. And the way that we go about this, because each of us are in different growing zones, the way that you do it is first go to Google and search the name of your city and growing zone. So for myself, that would be Squamish growing zone. Once you do that, it's going to just basically share with you what your growing zone is. So for myself, that's zone 7B. Okay, I now know that I'm in zone 7B. The next thing that you do is you search growing zone and whatever came back. So 7B, planting chart. And it's going to give you a whole page of planting charts. And on these planting charts, it's going to tell you basically each vegetable when you would go about starting it for your respective growing zone. And what I encourage you to do is like click into 2 or 3 or 4 of these and check, on each of them. When does each of them say to start your basil? When does each of them say to start your tomatoes? And you're going to get like a very good kind of like working hypothesis based off of checking a few of them. So to take a look at, say, the West Coast Seeds one for my area, if I wanted to start, say, something like artichokes, start indoors, I look for the ... And anytime between mid-January to mid-February would be a great time to be starting artichokes. So I'd go through each of the vegetables that I'm planning to have in my garden, and I'd find when it is saying to be starting these seeds either indoors or direct sown. And I would lastly add that onto my garden planning guide. So for myself, that means that kale, basil, and tomatoes, I'm starting in March, just around the corner now. And then for my zucchinis, I'll be starting those in April. And then for each and every one of you, you're going to start those seeds indoors and they're going to take off. They're going to be so happy. They're going to be growing so well. And then you're going to transplant them at the perfect time in the season. And I can be helping you on that front as well. And then before you know it, I kid you not, each and every one of you are going to be having beautiful harvests coming out of your garden. Again, everything that you're seeing in this picture right here, I got as a result of doing this garden planning exercise over the past seasons. And ultimately that informing when I would be starting these spaghetti squashes, when I would be starting these tomatoes, these cucumbers, how much space I would be giving them. So really this garden planning guide, it is the beginning of ultimately arriving at big and beautiful harvests just like this. So that is everything that I wanted to cover off on from a content perspective. In just a moment, I want to open it up for a little bit more Q&A. But just before we do that, I know there's already been a bunch of questions coming through, a couple of them that we answered. And I'm sure that a lot of you are also wondering, which seeds should I be starting indoors versus direct sowing into my garden? When do I go about transplanting those into the garden? What's the best soil that I should actually be growing in? On top of adding the compost, what's just like the soil foundation that I should be setting and establishing? And I know these questions come up all throughout the gardening season. And these are all the reasons why I ultimately launched Grounded. I can't answer all of the questions that I now get on Instagram or YouTube, etc. But within Grounded, I am there and I literally work directly with you and the other mentees to answer each and all of your questions and to guide you through the entirety of the gardening season. My guarantee is that by the end of the gardening season, you will go from feeling like a novice or kind of more on the inexperienced or beginner side of gardening to feeling confident and feeling competent in the garden. The way that I do that is through live lessons just like this. But then as alluded to, we also have those live office hours every week where we get to just geek out as gardeners and learn and chat with one another and learn from one another and the questions that each of us have. Then on top of that, the second piece to the program is that there's an on-demand content hub. And so all of the office hours, all of the live lessons, those are all uploaded into the content hub. But I also upload video growing guides into that hub. So let's say that you wanted to grow potatoes or carrots this year. Well, rather than starting from scratch and figuring it out on your own, I would encourage you to watch that video growing guide, because in that, I basically consolidate my 3, 4, 5 years of experience growing those particular crops and all of the very specific experiments that I've run to now share with you. This is how I go about growing potatoes or carrots. So your starting point doesn't, end up being year 0. You're now starting at like basically year 5 of where I am right now. That's going to save you so many years and ultimately result in you getting incredible bounties, incredible harvests way earlier on than figuring it out on your own. Third piece to it is that I have a private community where, once again, any question that you ask in there is answered within 24 hours. So I'm in there, I'm literally answering any questions that you're asking, and that's through the entirety of the gardening season. And then the last piece is that also in that private group, I'm doing weekly grounding challenges. So I share a grounding challenge once per week that is not at all focused on bounty or harvest or yield. And it is entirely focused on just simply trying to connect you with how peaceful and how restorative the garden is. So if you are interested in joining Grounded, February enrollments are now open. And what I'm doing for all of you that have RSVP'd for this happy hour is that you're getting $100 off your enrollment if you simply book your enrollment call before the end of the weekend. And the way that you go about doing that is right below the video player here in the description of the video is a link where you can book a one-on-one enrollment call with me. And I might have Mike just share that link into the chat function so that if anybody else is looking for it and can't find it, they can simply click on that in the chat function. All that you need to do is book your enrollment call with me before the end of the weekend. And then if you do end up enrolling and it does feel like the right fit, then we'll take $100 off of your enrollment. All of those one-on-one calls, those are with me. So we are going to chat one-on-one, and then I run the entirety of the program. So you are going to be working and operating directly with me. I don't have like a team or a group of individuals and then hide off in the corner. I lead every single session. I answer every single question in the group there. And I'd absolutely love to have a bunch of you into the program with the mentees that are already in there because we have so much fun geeking out as gardeners all together. So with that being said, folks, I would love to now open it up to any questions that folks might have. And let's answer a couple of these questions before we wrap up here for the end of the evening. All righty. I'm going to go ahead and pop over to the chat function here. All righty. From Justin, do you consider companion planting? Justin, great to have you online here. Always fun seeing your name. And so yeah, companion planting, for those of you that might not be familiar, is basically the process of planting some plants closer together or more densely because they're beneficial for one another. So as an example, tomatoes plus basil, that's a very symbiotic relationship. They grow really well together. The tomatoes are lower. The basil is lower. The tomatoes are higher. And then just the exchange that happens beneath the surface is meant to be beneficial for the flavor of each of them. And there's a whole slew of different companions and plants that grow well together, as well as plants that don't grow well together. For myself personally, I have played around with and I have experimented with some companion planting. What I found was that I just like, from more of a preference perspective, I like to have nice clean blocks of like, here's all of my basil, here's all of my kale, here are all of my cucumbers on a nice A-frame. And so it's a little bit of a less permaculture approach that I take and a bit more of an aesthetic approach that I take. And as a result, I don't practice as much companion planting as some folks. I certainly do the tomatoes and basil together, but beyond that, I focus probably a little bit more on specific blocks of crops and really focusing on maximizing the amount of sun that each of them get, especially when they are a sun-loving crop. Really great question there. And if you are thinking about companion planting, just Google West Coast Seeds Companion Planting Guide. It is probably one of their most in-depth guides. Really, really great information in there. It goes through like every vegetable, what it grows well with, what it doesn't grow well with. Super, super valuable resource there. All righty. From Hedia, how about succession planting? What should we plant as we harvest? Super good question there as well. And so there's, kind of like two schools that you could go down from a succession planting perspective. So one is the continuous succession planting. And so let's say that you wanted to have like leafy greens available on a, every 2-week basis. Well, then as you're doing your planting, you'd want to leave some space available because you know that in 2 weeks, you're going to start another set of seeds in there. And then 2 weeks later, you're going to do the third line or the third row of that particular seed. So you're going to plan it all out so that it's full. But then when you actually go to plant those seeds, you're going to do them in intervals. Then the second way to go about succession planting is when certain crops get harvested out and putting another crop in. And so a great example of this is garlic. All of the garlic gets harvested in mid to late July. And that means that, like, for myself, a full 4-foot by 8-foot raised bed, we can actually see it right behind me in the picture there. That whole bed is garlic at the moment. Late July, I pull all of it out. And about 1 month before that, so in late June, I start my broccolis, I start my cabbage, I start my cauliflower. I start all those in seed cells. And the moment that I pull out that garlic and harvest all of it, I then add 1 inch of compost into the bed and I transplant in all of those broccolis, cabbages, cauliflowers, etc. So they all now get put into that bed and they grow as a succession crop into the fall. And then I harvest those all out in late October. And I then put my garlic in to then begin its next growing season. So that's the other way that you could go about succession planting. And once again, like we could go, if we were answering this question within Grounded, you and I would, be starting to chat about like the specific crops that you're interested in, and how to go about succession planting those, maybe like radishes and carrots or brassicas, etc. So that's that's how I would go about approaching succession planting. And a fun fact on that front is that I don't actually plant any of the brassicas, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower. I don't start any of those seeds in the springtime. I start all those seeds at the very end of June and I grow them into the fall. All righty. Let's get a couple more here. Okay, from Carolee. Do you have any plans? Do you have plans for people who have to container garden? I have no area to put in beds. Perfect. So if you were drawing out your space for container gardening, what's cool about containers is that you can move them around. And so what I encourage you to do is draw out the outside perimeter. Let's say that it's a patio that you're on. So draw the outside perimeter of that patio with the right measurements, right? So maybe like 8 feet one way and 14 feet another way. And then what I want you to do is any permanent structures, right? So let's say like a table or a barbecue, etc., is go ahead and like black those out so that those squares are completely blacked out. What you're left with are these kind of like open areas, open pockets throughout your space. And what you can then do is place your containers into those areas. What I basically go off of is that a 5-gallon container is the same as 1 square foot. So now you have to kind of like think through, okay, what are the size of your containers? And if they're 5 gallons, you can assume 1 square foot. If they're 10 gallons, it's a little bit more than 1 square foot. It's probably more like 1.5 feet. So you go a little bit less than 2 square feet. And then you're going to place those all throughout those open spaces on the patio that have not been blacked out. And then as you get into the gardening season, the beauty with this is that you can kind of move them around a little bit. But now you've at least had a bit of a rough idea, a rough plan for how to go about planning them, and kind of not ending up starting and growing more than you have space for in your area. So that's what I would do from a planning perspective. From a soil perspective, I love going with 75% compost, 25% vermiculite for containers. And then at the point of transplanting, I do the exact same thing. I dig the transplant hole. I put 1 handful of my worm castings in, which you can see right beside me there in that bed. And then I put 1 tablespoon of the 444 into that transplant hole. I transplant in the seedlings, such as a tomato or a zucchini, backfill with the surrounding soil. And then I go ahead and add 1 more tablespoon of 444 around that plant. And then we could get into like irrigation for containers and trellising for containers, all that fun stuff. You can have an absolutely thriving container garden. Believe me on that. And there's even some crops such as peppers that actually grow better in containers than in raised beds, because they end up experiencing a little bit more stress, which results in them putting out more flowers. All righty, maybe I'll answer 1 or 2 more questions here. Let's see. Okay, fun question here from Mirny. Speaking of garlic, mine is up 6 inches. Seems to have coped with the Vancouver snow. Seems early this year. Will harvest be early this year as well? Great question there. And yeah, I'd say that, it's definitely on the coast here been a moderate winter so far. And so the garlic is, you kind of, I'd say has a little bit of a head start, or it's certainly off to the races. In terms of like when we'll harvest our garlic, it's really too early to say, right? Like so much of that is going to be determined based on the spring and early summer that we have, how hot it is, how dry it is, how much rain we get. Those will all impact whether we harvest them on the earlier side or a little bit later on, or kind of like in the regular time as well. So like last year we had a really warm, really dry spring and summer. And so as a result of that, I know a lot of people were harvesting kind of like 2 to 3 weeks earlier than usual. So yeah, it will depend on what unfolds over the months ahead here. What I would say as well on that front is that like there's no rush to harvest garlic. So don't feel like, even if 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of the leaves have died off and the plant's looking almost like completely yellow, I've left garlic in the ground until mid-September just to see what happens. And there was still a head of garlic at the bottom there. Some of the paper started to like kind of like die off a little bit. So it wasn't like, fully wrapped cloves at that point, but they were all still 100% usable and enjoyable. And as a matter of fact, like, hey, it saved me from having to peel each of those cloves individually. So not the worst problem to have. All righty. Ooh, great question from Laura here. How do you work in rotating crops from year to year? Awesome question there. I practice zero crop rotation. So this is a fun one that comes up quite a bit. And the whole notion of crop rotation, that comes from like larger farming practices, right? So like when you're farming on several acres, and the reason why they rotate their crops is because they can't amend each of those beds, right? So going back to that question earlier about like what do I do to the soil and how I add 1 inch of soil to each of those beds. Well, you can't do that when you're gardening or when you're farming several acres. But in a backyard environment, we can add 1 inch of compost to each one of the beds. So each and every year they're rejuvenated, they're recharged, they're totally filled back up with nutrients for the growing season. And therefore, we don't need to be rotating those crops. Second piece is that in a backyard environment, we generally have way more sun constraints than what you would see and experience in a farming setup. And so what you then are wanting to do is you want to actually be focusing on maximizing sun exposure rather than practicing crop rotation, right? Like I want to find the absolute best spot for my tomatoes and for my garlic. And once I see them growing really well there, I'm going to leave them in that area. I'm not going to rotate them out from that area. Which brings us to the third and final piece. The only time that I would go about rotating crops is if there was a disease that was setting in on that plant for 2 seasons at least. So I wait until like, if there's a blight that shows up one season, I don't rotate the crop. But if it's showing up again the next year and it's really bad, I then rotate that crop out and put a new one in. So the only time that I would practice any crop rotation was if there was a disease that was building up. And then at that point, I would go about rotating it into a new area. So that's my thoughts on crop rotation. All righty. I think that might be just about it here, folks. I'll hang online just to see if there's maybe 1 or 2 more questions. From Linda, where can you get vermiculite? You can get that at a lot of garden centers and nurseries. They'd have it. Just give them a call ahead of time, asking them to if they have it. For myself, I buy a lot of stuff from Uline just for like the different things that I package up, like the worm castings and seedling mix, etc. They happen to sell vermiculite as well, so I just get mine directly from them, and from them I can get them in like 100+ liter bags. So if you're looking at a significant volume, then you could actually look into getting it from them, and they'll ship it directly to your door. All righty, folks. I think we will go ahead and start wrapping up here. Thank you all so much for the kind words. Oh, it's so fun to be back growing with each and every one of you, doing these happy hours. I hope to be connecting with a few of you in regards to Grounded and seeing if it's the right fit for some of you. Yeah, if you have any questions, definitely send them through. And then, yeah, if you do want to speak directly with me about enrolling in Grounded, just check that link. I'll email it all out as well as the recording here and the garden planning guide tomorrow. But thank you all so much for the kind words, for your attention, and have a lovely rest of your evening. And hey, I'll see you all on the next happy hour. See you then. Take care, everybody. Bye.